Got it.
And that is what we have come to call the Zoom Collect. So,
Hi, Betsy.
Betsy J is joining us. Betsy is a chaplain.
Hi.
Well, Deanna, the floor is yours then. Thank you for being with us.
Great, thank you. And listen, thank you for having me and for your willingness to engage the topic of gun violence. It is it's a fun one. So I'll just give you a brief introduction about me. I don't know how much you know, but you know, I'm here in Dallas, Texas. I grew up in Texas, grew up to a family of hunters. I went to seminary. I was first called with a sense of spiritual direction, and I just to be a spiritual director. But I kept taking more classes. My husband said it was only supposed to be 2 classes, and I kept taking more classes. Ended up in the ordination track and wasn't really sure where I was going to go, and was kind of in this process of discernment. And the NRA came to town, and that was when I felt a sense to call to the ordained ministry of to work in gun violence prevention. And that was in 2018, but and I had graduated seminary in 2015. So I'd spent a couple of years really, I still had kids at home trying to figure out what this was going to look like. But I entered gun violence prevention because Texas passed a law that allowed guns on college campuses. And like I said, I was from a family of gun owners. I never had really thought much about our gun laws until then. And I was able to see how my daughter's friends responded to the law. And what I learned was they responded exactly how the law was intended, and that they saw it as an invitation to buy guns and to become armed. And it was when a boy that she was courting came over to my house for dinner, and as he was sitting down at my table, he told me that he was counting down the days till his 21st birthday so he could go get his concealed handgun license. And that did not sit well with me as I continued to listen to what he was going to do with that gun. That's when it really became clear to me that he had no idea how to handle a gun, what he should do with the gun. And he thought that just the mere presence and owning one was instantly going to turn him into Jason Bourne. And he was going to be able to go out and, you know, take out all the bad guys. And so I became very afraid for my daughter and her safety. And I didn't really know what to do. I wondered, you know, and that was when a friend of mine had just joined Moms Demand Action. So that's where I got my start, was being involved in Moms Demand Action. Like I said, it was at that, when the NRA was in town, I was part of an interfaith prayer vigil. And that was when I really felt a sense of call to combine my faith with my gun violence prevention efforts. And mainly because being Presbyterian, you know, this was an interfaith group. And I was like, man, we got the policy, right? Like all these other traditions are turning to us because we're the ones with the policy. We were the ones that had, you know, a lot of more progressive, so to speak, than many of the other traditions. But yet I was the only Presbyterian that was there that day. There was multiple, or that weekend, there was multiple Methodist, Baptist. But I was like, where are the Presbyterians? Where are we in this? Why we have policy, but yet it didn't seem to be translating down into, you know, the actual church. And so that is when I saw it, like, so how can I do this? And the place that I saw that stuff was happening was in the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, that they had a little active group that was working on implementing the policy in the church. And so, which there's a toolkit that they had developed as a resource for churches to be able to use. And where what we've discovered is one of the hard things about keeping the church engaged in gun violence prevention is it oftentimes ends up being just advocacy work, right? And being from Texas, advocacy is like a lost cause, right? Like I'm not going to persuade Ted Cruz on any planet at any time, you know, to have a different stance on gun violence, right? Like it's not going to happen. So that's what I said. If that's the only option that you're going to give me, like I'm done, right? And so then it turns into, then you got to elect candidates. And again, the church, it's hard for the church to get engaged in that role. But what the church can do, and this is one of the things that when I go and talk to churches, I do a PowerPoint presentation on really identifying the hidden forces behind our gun violence. And it's exactly what I named with my daughter. It's gun sales. It's all about gun sales. And the fact that the gun is a non-consumable product and it needs to be sold in a saturated market. And so it becomes just basic accounting and economics, marketing, right? And this goes all the way back to the turn of the century in the 1800s and the end of the Civil War. And that was really when the gun factory became prominent. And so gun business started as the war business. And whenever the war was happening, these factories were able to produce guns. But as soon as peacetime came, their whole market went away. And so it became a matter of these gun factories, these gun manufacturers really needed a market. So they went to the government and they said, if you want to have guns to fight your wars, we're going to need a market. So they turned to consumers. And that began first with men. And there was the boy plan, in which it was intentionally marketed. The gun was intentionally marketed to boys between the ages of 10 and 16. So that gun ownership became synonymous with becoming a man. And so what the genius of that is so now you've instilled into the male psyche, into the family relationships, future customers, right? Because these men are then going to tell their sons when they turn 16, or in the case of my own father, who didn't have a son, but he had 2 daughters. So at 12 years of age, you get your first gun and you learn how to shoot and you go out. And so it's normalized. So gun ownership becomes normalized. And that's where we are today and what we're witnessing, and why there's such a push to get the guns in the school, why there's such a push to get guns in churches, is because we need customers, right? This non-consumable product needs to be sold, and those gun manufacturers are cranking them out like crazy. So if you'll indulge me a minute, I'm gonna do a little screen share just to show you a chart, because I think this is the most valuable, and that you can see. So this goes back to 1986 and gun manufacturing, and how it really held pretty steady up until, you start to see the first increase kind of right here in 2008, 2009, and then you start to have really heavy increases. And again, this is gun manufacturing. Right now, that translates into gun sales. But again, this is the factory that's cranking out, right? Like these non-consumable products that they have to sell in a saturated market. So here's just a couple of interesting tidbits. Your first big bump during these times were 1993 and 1994. So what happened around that time was you had Waco and Ruby Ridge, which was when the government began to seize weapons, right? So that became their new marketing, was that the government is going to take your guns away. And so that, because it gave a little uptick, but again, it wasn't long lasting, because again, at this time, you really only had about 1/3 of the male population that was really buying guns. The rest of the population didn't. And what I find really fascinating is September 11th, 2001. Look at this. That's the lowest year of gun manufacturing, right? So this story that we hear all the time about foreign terrorists, well, it didn't translate into gun sales. So that's problematic. What translates into gun sales is our own government taking our guns away, not the threat of foreign terrorists, right? You also had the election of, this is George Bush, right? This is W. And so again, Republican leadership, you can see, tends to keep, when there's a Republican president, those numbers stay low versus other times. And that's what starts to happen when you see this uptick, right? We had 3 things that really went into effect. And one is you have the invention of social media. So Twitter and Facebook were founded in 2004 and like 2006. So that's beginning to take off. You have the Heller court decision, 2008, which changed the way that the Second Amendment was interpreted. Before this time, it always been interpreted as a collective right. It's now interpreted as an individual right. So this came from decades of advocacy and on the part of the NRA, and this was their main great accomplishment, was switching that to individuals, because again, this is who your market is, right? You've got to get it in the hands of individuals, because clearly military, right? Like there's a war going on here. It's no longer impacting gun sales. So you got to get something in the hands of those individuals. And the third thing that happened, the election of Barack Obama, and he's going to take your guns away, right? So you start to see this big increase, but the biggest one that kind of happens at first is this 2013. But you know what happened in December of 2012? Sandy Hook. And everybody wants to know, this was horrible. Why don't we have any gun legislation? This, my friends, is why. It's the horrible truth that killing kindergartens, it sells guns, right? Because that was instantly, the NRA came out with the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, right? And so we have to, now you have this booming industry around school safety and how to get guns in schools. And what's going to happen if you get a gun in a school is, again, you're going to normalize children to the presence of guns. And so that's the most important thing that you want if you're in the gun business, is you want all those kids to understand that the only way they can be safe is with a gun. So that's the big lie that the gun industry tells. And that's where the role of the church comes in. And so the church gets to do two things. One, we get to tell the truth, and we get to start telling the truth about where our real safety is, and that our safety lies in community and caring and loving for one another. That's the message of Jesus, right? He turned away from violence and he turned towards love your neighbor, right? Love God, love neighbor. That's where we're going to find our safety. And so that's the message that we have to tell. And as people go through that transition, what the church has to offer is we can become chop saw churches. And so we can be a safe place for people to surrender unwanted guns. And like I said, these guns are non-consumable. So that means they're not gonna, it's not like trash. You can't throw it in the trash. It's not gonna compost. It's not something that you use up like toilet paper. So a gun can outlive its owner for a long time, right? Like my husband's rifle is a 1904 Springfield and it still works. And so, it was a life before him and it's going to work a life after him. And so there are a lot of inherited guns out there these days, and people need to know, what do I do with them? Am I going to have to store them safely for the rest of my life and then hope they don't get in the hands of either a suicidal relative, get stolen and used, for harm? Those are oftentimes ones that are used if there's a break-in in the home that get used, or those unintentional shootings of just children getting a hold of them because people don't know how to store them. They don't know what to do with them. So this is really a role for the church to be able to help with that, to be able to be this place where we can help you. We can disarm these guns for you. The other thing that's often that I've experienced is not only, sometimes are these inherited guns, but they come with stories, right? Like I disarmed for a family 7 guns that belonged to the father. He used to torture them with them. He used to threaten them with them. So there was so much that came with these guns. And so there's pastoral care that needs to happen, right? Like to be present with these people, to hear their stories, to pray with them. The funny thing is, the day when I was disarming, I was at a church. It was an old church built in the 1800s. And I was new to my saw and how to use it. And I blew their power like 3 times. And then on the 4th one, they finally plugged it in directly to this power source. And I'd figured out, like, okay, if I just go a little and back off, a little and back off, a little and back off, instead of trying to force it, like I was holding the power, and because I was on the last one that needed to be disarmed. And the woman was telling me, she was like, I was just praying the whole time that you'd get it. You know, they had to go, they had to go. And so this is what churches can do. You know, there are stories about guns that have been used in suicide, and so they get returned to the family. We've been partnering with Raw Tools, and so they take these gun parts and they turn them into garden tools. So it's literally, we're embodying swords to plowshares, right? Where we're taking that instrument of violence and it's getting turned into an instrument of life. And he was telling me, Mike Martin with Raw Tools said that he has disarmed a gun that is still in the evidence box that's been handed to the family directly from the police. And so, you know, what are they going to do? I've heard another story of a gun that was from a son that ended up getting in trouble and was living a unscrupulous life. And so this gun got filed in the back of a filing cabinet. And when they heard, it was a friend of the Peace Fellowship, a member of the Peace Fellowship, and when they heard that we were disarming guns, they instantly reached out and said, we have this gun. And again, like going there and getting it, you know, the stories of broken relationship, the sadness of a life, you know, for this young man who didn't turn out quite the way that they were hoping. And so there's so much grief that comes oftentimes with these, you know, these weapons. And so this is the work of the church. I can't imagine a more prophetic and pastoral role for the church. And so that's what we in the Peace Fellowship are trying to do, is to get congregations to become, to get chop saws and just let people know, we can disarm your weapons for you. And we do it according to ATF guidelines. There's never a transfer of ownership. You're performing a service for the gun owner, and you're going to disarm it with 3 chops, so that where the receiver, which is kind of where the working part of the gun is, in order to so that it's no longer a fireable weapon is how it works. And so because the gun owner is present the whole time you're performing the service, there's no laws that are ever broken. And then, like I said, and then we just send them off to Raw Tools, and then they convert it. So like I'm wearing, so this is a heart. Shane Claiborne gave this to me. He made it out of a gun. This is a gun barrel, and they put a little dent in it and turned it into a heart. And so they also make jewelry, and I have, sorry, I should get better at making sure my, here's my shovel. And here's my hand tool that again is made from, this part is, you know, the metal, and then this part is gun stock that has been formed into the handle. So this whole shovel is from a gun. So we've been doing this by running action circles, and we've had 2. This is a new initiative for the Peace Fellowship. We've had 2, and currently we have kind of 6 congregations that are pursuing having Guns to Gardens events. We've got one in Atlanta, a UCC in Columbus, one in Presbyterian in Cleveland, Stockton, Sandy U-Haul, and Baltimore is kind of where this initial group is. But one of the things that we've heard and we've learned is people want to hear from other people, right? Like how y'all are meeting together as a group to support one another. And so that's what we're doing with these action circles. I mean, we're giving you information on how to do this, but more importantly, we're building community so that you can be in conversation and learn from other congregations that are going through this. So our next action circle is in January. It's the 13th. It's going to run for 3 weeks, 13th, 27th, and February 10th. And then in essence, you can begin, so is how we kind of say, and then we continue to meet once a month just for continual learning and follow up and support. So that's there's what I'm doing in a nutshell, I guess. the quick 15-minute spiel, elevator pitch. So I'll open for questions.
The action circles, is there information about those at the PPF website? Or
There is, and let me see, I think I'm gonna put it in the chat. I think I copied it. Yeah, here we go. Here's the link. I just put it in the chat. And you'll find there the information to sign up. There's also a video that we made that does a little bit more explaining kind of about what we're asking, that because some of the churches that have run through it, they said, could you make a video that we could share with our congregations that explains this so that people can have a better idea? And so that's also on the website that you can see. It's about I'll try to make it 4 minutes because people, you got to keep their attention span. So
I have two questions. One is, are any of the churches that are currently involved, are they rural or are they urban, suburban? And the second is, can you send us information as well about the company that is turning the guns into plowshares?
yeah, so that's rawtools.org. So you should be able to find them through that.
there's a link, the site, the page you just sent us, there's a link to Raw Tools on that page.
On it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Sandy, Utah is debatable how rural that is, but because it's Utah, I think it's a suburb of Utah. You might be able to classify it as it's a gun owning area. And then Stockton, California is, even though it's in California, it is it's more rural there, and they have a high degree of violence. But what's interesting is there's still a lot of resistance in the congregation. We'll talk about this, in the training, but we realize there's a level of risk involved in this. We do believe that that's part of our call as followers of somebody who died on a cross, right? That there is something about there's risk to being faithful, and we believe that there are ways to do this to minimize those risks so that it's safe. And so we offer that, like how to do this at the comfort level of your church. So like for me, I'm not necessarily widely advertising, like putting a public announcement. I'm just starting with the people in my networks and Raw Tools sending me names. And so that's a place to just start, to just begin. You might be surprised how many, again, like inherited weapons that there can be. And that was when I was back before the pandemic and I was traveling and I was doing this talk. It always amazed me how many people, because the other thing that I would do is show people how to do circle conversations in order to have challenging conversations, and how many people would go, oh yeah, you know what? I think I have a gun somewhere in my basement that I might have inherited from my dad, so they have no clue even where it is, what those are ripe to be stolen by suicidal relatives, right? Like those are the ones that we most want to get, is the ones that people are not securely storing them or even paying attention to them. Because I consider safe storage means you're checking on it on the regular, right? You're making sure that that gun is still where it is and where it needs to be, because it is a deadly weapon. And if you are a responsible gun owner, that's part of it. That's what it means to be a responsible gun owner.
When you talk about disarming a gun, what exactly are you doing? What's that process?
Yeah, so a chop saw, and it's in the video that's on the website, you'll be able to see. but you securely clamp it, and it's usually 3 cuts that you make across this receiver. So it's just taking that saw down and cutting through, breaking the weapon, cutting it again, and breaking it. It takes, so one, I want to be clear, I can do this, and I never worked a chop saw before. So it's not the easiest thing on the planet, but it's not hard. So don't necessarily let skills get in the way. In fact, my husband, who is actually quite good at, he works with machining and tools and saws on the regular, and he almost knew too much, because he was like, well, you can't cut through that with this, and anyway, so it doesn't have to be that hard. You just cut, you just take the saw and you just go down, and it makes cuts, and they fall apart and they disarm. The hardest part of the process for me is getting it clamped. And so it really, long guns are easy because you've got a lot to clamp on there. And so a long gun takes, maybe 5 minutes, because there is time to just cut through metal. And that's why you want a metal chop saw. There's a particular blade, and we give you all that information in the action circles. But those handguns are trickier because you don't have a lot to clamp sometimes. So those can take longer.
What engagement do you have, if any, with the police force in a given area?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's going to vary. We are trying to encourage folks to not involve the police, because police can be very problematic in this process, in that they have different, it depends on what your goal is. And for us, the goal, that we see the role of the church is to disarm weapons, right? To get these guns and to, turn them into plowshares, literally, swords into plowshares. That's our goal, right? We're not interested in punishment. We're not interested in any type of, I don't know, attaching blame, so to speak, or anything like that. And so sometimes police have these requirements that can make it more challenging, and things that they want to do or things that they have to do in order to be involved. So there was a church here, First Pres Dallas, used to do gun buybacks back in like 2013, 2014, 2015. And they said they couldn't involve the police for that very reason. They had this long questionnaire that they wanted filled out, and they were like, no, that's not what we're about. We want people to be able to surrender their gun no matter what their situation is. And so they couldn't involve the police. Sometimes police presence can deter someone who may really need to get rid of that weapon. Because oftentimes what churches are going to do, everybody thinks about crime guns. That's really not usually what you do. You're usually getting guns out of homes with families, and keeping children or elderly safe is generally what shows up. And that's what Bruce Buchanan was the pastor at First Pres, and he told me that they did like 5 gun buybacks. And again, that was a different thing that they were doing. They were taking the guns and they were creating an arsenal, right? Because they weren't disarming them, and they were transferring ownership. So we're not doing that. We are now sometimes you'll hear the word gun buyback in the sense that you might offer a gift card or an incentive for the gun, right? Like some type of monetary value as a thank you, but there's no transfer of ownership, and you're disarming it right there. So you don't have the risk of creating an arsenal, because they would bring in anywhere from like 90 to 100 guns at a buyback. He said, over the 5 of them, they collected over 700 guns. And he said there were maybe 2, 3 max that they ever would have thought, might there be more of a story to this one? But oftentimes, if it's a gun that's used in a crime, as my husband says, those actually are consumable, because they get thrown in the river, right? Like they're not coming to you to get rid of it. right? Like there are other options if you really, wanted to get rid of a gun. We're talking about, like I said, guns that are generally, the people want to make sure they're not going to be used for harm.
Maybe this information is on the website, but how does a congregation typically publicize that they are offering this service to the community?
Yeah, so like I said, it depends on what level you're willing to start, and so you can do it through church bulletins. You can do it through presbyteries. You can do it through sister organizations. So if you have, like when I got involved, it was Faith Forward Dallas was the name. So it was an interfaith group, right? And it was a group that was dedicated, different faith leaders in the area that were dedicated to making the city of Dallas a more compassionate place. So that's the organization here that I would send through. And so that can include, again, all their contacts of other organizations that might be interested in creating a more compassionate Dallas. And so that's one way. So, and then of course there's, depending on how big you want to go, you can go press releases. We just had that was one of our follow-up. We had our initial 3, and then we had our follow-up, because again, we're not trying to say start big. If you don't know how to use your saw, you're going to want to start where you can just learn how to do some cuts, because those 7 guns that I did took they were 45 minutes to an hour, right? So because I had to learn how to get it on the saw, and that wasn't even my first rodeo doing it, and it still took me a while. You can go to sorry, I had a brain freeze. Schools, your local schools, and find welders or students that may know how to operate saws that you could invite to come do this for you if nobody in your community wants to take on that responsibility. But we see this as a great opportunity to involve lots of folks in your church and in your community, not just who might be your gun violence activists, so to speak. But and the other thing that's really helpful, you got to have somebody who's going to operate the saw. And like I said, which can be anybody. I can do it, or you can get a student from community college. That's the word I was looking for. Or and then the other thing you really need is you need to have somebody who's familiar with handling a gun, which could be your police. But again, not often. Like I said, we don't really encourage that as a surefire way. There's I'm in Texas, so I got somebody who can handle all kind of weapons at the drop of a hat. So that's what the guy that helps me is. He's a Methodist pastor here. He grew up in Arkansas, again, family of gun owners. He had like 7 maybe, and as he became a pastor, as he was going through seminary, again, he was like realizing, ooh, am I turning away from violence and turning towards Christ? Am I really doing that? And so for him, that was part of his, he saw that as how he embodied his baptismal and his vows of, ministry. And he disarmed his guns. And so he is the guy who comes and helps me to make sure, even though we tell when we advertise to make sure that they're unloaded and in the trunk of the car, because you also don't want the people to have guns on your campus to be holding them. But again, we'll teach you all that. But again, those are kind of the 2 main components. Is when I was in Boulder and they were doing this, I went to it's a UCC church in Boulder that was blocks from the King Super. And so after that, if you remember, that was one of the first that, really public mass shootings. Mass shootings didn't go away during the pandemic. They just weren't the ones that made the news. And so this is the one that made the news. And so they decided to hold to hold a Guns to Gardens event for their community. And they brought in 34 guns, and I was there and able to witness and see how that whole community was transformed, the power of the healing. And they said, they were like, you know, it happened in our own backyard and we feel powerless. There's nothing we can do. But they said, we can, and this is what we can do. And so the folks who showed up, the very first one was an 80-year-old woman who could barely drive her car. And so she had these 2 guns that belonged to her husband. And so of course she didn't know if they were unloaded. She had no clue. So that's why it is helpful to have somebody. And they did have 2 police officers that were there, because they had about, because again, if you do gift cards and you do a big thing, we don't encourage this to start. So I don't like, if you give people too much information, they go, oh no, that's awful. But that's like having cash. So they had, basically equivalent of $20,000 cash on their property. And so that was what they actually had police officers there for, was they were concerned about that. And they had, and the local police were skeptical. This was a very outspoken congregation who had spoken out, during the defund the police movement. And, but there was an officer who was killed in that King Super, and they had a relationship with him. He had served because they're such an outspoken congregation, they had received threats, and he had been assigned to protect the pastor at one point in time. So there was a very close connection there. They asked for 5, they got 2. They got 2 police officers, and the police officers, again, were pretty skeptical, but by the end said, when you do this again, we will be there, because you are getting the guns that are causing the most harm and we can't get them. These are the ones we want. And so even the police were transformed and were totally on board with what the church was doing.
Can you talk more about that? The guns that are causing the most harm?
Yeah, because they're the ones that aren't secure, right? Like this 80 something year old woman, he said, somebody's going to break into her home and use them on her. It's ones that, again, that lead to suicide or unintentional shootings. They're the unsecured weapons that are in homes that aren't being properly monitored, secured, and making sure they don't get in the hands. I had a friend, so here's a story for you. Even when you think it's properly secured, her son, she was for his 18th birthday, his dad gave him a handgun, and they were at dinner. It was his birthday dinner, and he was showing it off to the people that were there. They were divorced, so the father was not in the home and the mother was not happy. This is actually the woman who invited me to join Moms Demand Action. This is her story. And the next day, one of the people that were at the dinner came back with his 8-year-old daughter. And he said, I brought a present for your son. I didn't realize it was his birthday. And so I have something. Will you mind staying with it? And I'll just go put it in his room. The next day, they found out the man committed suicide. And he used her son's gun. He came back, stole it from their home while she was there talking to the 8-year-old daughter in her living room. It wasn't locked up in a case.
Oh.
I mean, it was in a case, right? Because handguns oftentimes come with a case that you can put a lock on. But it was still sitting out where somebody could take it and grab it and go use it to do suicide with. So statistics say that even guns that are in homes that are locked, you're still twice as likely to have somebody in that home die, because there is no such thing as really safe storage. It's really kind of a myth, unless you.
So it's the unattended or poorly attended gun that is really the danger.
Correct.
That's good information. Just out of curiosity, how are you and Shane Claiborne collaborating?
We are, yeah. In fact, because he and Raw Tools, he and Mike Martin wrote the book Beating Guns, and Shane has just started Raw Tool Philly. That's going to be the first what are they calling it? Cooperative that Raw Tools is doing. Raw Tools' ultimate goal is to have kind of blacksmiths throughout the country so that the guns that are disarmed, you know, they want churches to become, and it changed word to be a chop saw church, that if we can be chop saw churches, we're going to provide the raw material, so to speak, right, for these blacksmiths to be able to turn into the tools and then to be able to use them actually in the community. Because there's another piece of this that comes with the forge, right? And being able to beat on the weapons and the healing that comes with that and the community building. And Shane is doing it. He got a grant just recently, and that's why he started Raw Tools Philly. And he does it with kids. Like, he's teaching the kids how to work the saws and how to forge and be able to turn them into garden tools. So he's actually, you know, this is something you can teach kids to do.
Wow.
In theory. I mean, like high school age kids, right? Like,
Yeah, any other questions? Deanna, I can't thank you enough for being here today. This has been tremendous. So
Just one quick
thank you.
One question. Are there any in our area, churches that are doing this?
Not that I've heard. You can be the first.
there you go, Kevin.
I know how to use a chop saw. I was going to ask, what do you do with all the sparks?
You just have to have it at a spark safe location.
Yeah.
You know, like, and again, and so, I mean, I always have like a bucket of water handy, and I did get a little fire extinguisher, but really, like I said, after I was in Boulder and I witnessed, I mean, like I said, they had 4 chop saws set up. So that's, again, if you're going to do a big thing where you're inviting a lot of people at a time, you're probably going to want more than one station. So again, this is something that can grow to all kinds of levels and all kinds of sides, but you can also just be, here's in my church, and everybody finds out. And so you get, so like Mike Martin just recently had a call, had a guy inherited guns from his brother, 150.
Wow.
150 guns. So he and his dad went, and it took him like 4 hours, he said, to disarm those. It was interesting. There were 77 handguns and 77 long guns. Like, the guy had like a matching, and he had them all labeled, like because he put pictures. I think you can see it on the Raw Tools website. If not, I suggest Facebook, follow Raw Tools on Facebook and see, you know, kind of.
They have some videos showing how they clamp those handguns in, because that's got to be really tough in that space where the blade comes down.
It is, and that's what we do teach it. Like, we have a video. If you're really good and feel capable, the best way to do is to get the hand miter saw, and then you get a clamp. That's how Mike's dad Fred does it, is he clamps them, and then you have a little bit more control, but it takes, you know, somebody to feel confident doing that. But you can do it on the, like I said, it takes a little bit longer.
Yeah. So I was going to say, if you had a good vise, you could take your Sawzall and just use a metal blade.
Yep.
Same way I cut apart my old.
And that's how they do it. And they save, like, so like a revolver, like, they're saving that part, and they're now turning it into like tractor tires.
Oh.
They're making tractor tires out of those. The scopes, they'll keep those, and they're making microscopes out of them. A lot of those guns, like that 150, those handguns, they come in cases, because a lot of them have, you know, gun cases, and they're figuring out how to turn those into first aid kits for folks.
Cool.
So they're trying to use every part of that gun that they can.
Yeah. Very cool.
All right. Well, thanks again, Deanna. And I'll be sure to share
thank you.
the information with everybody. So
Yeah, I hope to see some of y'all in our action circles.
is there a prayer that you are particularly drawn to, that you pray with people in this work, that you can close us with?
Yeah, I wish that's a great question, and nobody's ever asked me that before. And I have to say that I have hope someday somebody was going to show up and provide that to me. So
Time to write one.
I got it there. You guys are pastors, right? Like this is what you do. So I keep hoping who's gonna do it. And here's my requirement. Don't make it so long that we don't listen. Right? you gotta come up with short, sweet, to the point. But no, I don't have one, but I'd love to
But you
hear
start out
somebody
with,
else's voice.
You start out by saying, shoot, Lord. we
Ooh.
don't want
There
to
you
shoot
go.
no more.
Awesome. I feel like
Sorry.
you're our closing prayer. I feel like this has gone to you.
There you go.
I'm feeling the Spirit calling you.
But okay, I will. I'll be happy
Thanks.
to. Lord, when you say guns into plowshares, that stirs something within our souls from the Spirit. And what it means for each one of us may be different. But what it means for all of us is your peace that passes all understanding, pervading our society, pervading our communities, and taking away the option of war from our hearts. We thank you, Lord, for the work this group is doing and for Deanne sharing with us today. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
All right,
all.
friends. The Lord be with you.
And also with
And also
you.
with you.
Okay. Bye now.
Lord, peace. Bye-bye.